welcome everybody to this webinar. It's going to be a slightly different way of doing it this time, because actually by now we don't just have to talk theoretically about what everybody's doing. We actually have some practical examples. So I'm absolutely thrilled today on this webinar, where we're going to talk about the new reality, to be joined by my co-managing directors. Co-managing directors, isn't that a marvelous thing? Harriet Molyneaux and Emma Birchall, and they're going to talk about how they are seeing some of these challenges with particular focus on a couple of companies. We're going to actually look at what Arup is doing, and Harriet's going to tell us about that. And also Brit Insurance, and Emma's going to talk about that. So let's just take a look at where this fits in the whole webinar series. So this, of course, we started, as you know, right from the beginning, looking at what we thought were some of the really big issues that we could see emerging from March onwards. And actually, if you sort of look at our pandemic series, what you'll see is the first thing we noticed is that you were at home with kids. And actually, we've been doing our survey, our COVID survey, and many of you have filled that in. Thank you for doing that. And of course, what we found is that you were being interrupted all the time, and we had to really think about families and work. We then began to see from our data that well-being was becoming a real issue. So our second webinar was really about where are we in terms of our well-being? We're stuck at home, we're not moving around. And then we began to realize something we'd actually seen at the very beginning, which is when we said, what's your experience of working from home? Many of you said, I miss my social connections, I miss my friends, I miss my colleagues. And so we ran a third webinar on collaboration. And that actually turned out to be really important, because what we're still noticing is that you're spending more time with people you know very well, and less time with that diverse, serendipitous network. And that continues to be a worry for us, which is why when Harriet talks a little bit more about Arup, we're going to learn quite a lot more about how do you build serendipitous conversations when actually you're all sitting miles away from each other in terms of your offices. We then looked at what does it mean for leaders, because by then leaders were really needing to step up. And our last webinar was about embracing new realities. And we'll send you an email after this, which gives you a link to all of these. So please do take a look at them. They're available. They're really fascinating. I, as you know, have also been keeping a diary. This is volume 3, by the way. Volume 3 of the diary. I can't even remember what day we're on. I think it's day 150. I've sort of almost lost the will to live on this one, but I am still keeping the diary. And that's really what I want to talk about today, because what I want to talk about today is, you know, where are we on all of this? And I want to really help us to think about that by using the notion of freeze and unfreeze and refreeze. Now, let me spend a little bit of time helping us all think this through. I don't know about you. I know that some of you have been trained in change management, so I'd love to hear those of you who are. But do you remember that when we were first trained in change management all those years ago, one of the ways that people often helped us think about change was to use the notion of freeze, unfreeze, refreeze. And let me say a little bit about each one of those. So freeze is where you are normally, you know, the normal organization that you're in terms of its practices, its processes, its culture, and so on. And then when we attempted to change an organization, we called it unfreeze. What we said is that things were beginning to change, to break down, to unfreeze the practices and processes, the way we did work. And then the hope was that after the change program, things refreezed in a different way. Now, of course, one of the most exciting aspects of the COVID pandemic, and I know it's ridiculous to use that word because it's not been particularly exciting, it's been frightening and unfamiliar. But one of the things that has been interesting for all of us who are leaders and managers in organizations is that our organizations have unfrozen in a way that we really haven't ever seen before. I mean, those of you who know my work know that for more than 10 years, we've been leading the Future of Work consortium on the future of work. We've been talking about the future of work, but actually I've been, a little bit sad at times about how slow companies are to change. Well, my goodness me, in the last 3 months, we've all changed. We've all been forced to change. And remember that habits take about 12 weeks to change. We are way past 12 weeks. So the sort of habits that you're now developing and your employees are developing are beginning to be the basis of change. Now, let's think about Refreeze for a moment. One thing we know is that very few people want to get back to where they've been. In fact, in our survey, it was 1%, only 1% people have said, I'd like to get back to where I was. We want to embrace some of these aspects of our new reality. But to do that, we've got to decide what it is we want the refreeze to look like. Now, some people, when I've used the metaphor last week, a few people said to me, well, couldn't it sort of be like slush? Couldn't we just always be in an unfrozen state? Well, the truth is that's not the case. It won't be like slush. I mean, your organizations will refreeze. And my guess is they're beginning to refreeze now. The crystals are beginning to form. So one of the questions I think we need to address right now, I mean this week, next week, is as your organization begins to decide what shape it wants to be in the refreeze, you've got to decide the architecture in a way that you want it to freeze around, because otherwise it's going to start freezing in ways that you're going to regret, and it's going to be hard for you to change. So this, dear friends, is a very important time for us, because we've got to be sure that as we begin to refreeze, we really get the sort of thing that we want. Now, what might that look like? Well, I'm going to suggest that there are 3 guiding principles that I certainly believe to be important. I've written, as you know, over COVID, I've done 2 things. I've run a series of webinars, and I've also written columns for MIT Sloan. This is the next column. It'll be out sometime next week, I think. We'll send you a link to it once it comes out so that you can take a look at it. But this is what I've said in this column. Now, each of you are going to find your own guiding principles. So I'm not suggesting that these should be true for everybody, but I would say that if I was running a company right now, as indeed I am with HSM, these are my guiding principles. And I want to talk about each of them in a bit more detail. The first is that, as you refreeze, there's got to be something good for people. There's got to be a good side for people. There's got to be an upside. There has to be something where people say, I know why I'm going to be working as I will in the future. So my number 1 principle is accentuate and build in the upside. So one of the questions I'm going to ask you to think about right now is, what are the upsides of where you think your organization is going to go? Secondly, we need to keep on adjusting. Nobody knows what our organization is going to look like in April of next year. Nobody knows that. But what we do know is that we have to experiment and make constant adjustments. And thirdly, there are really hard questions that we're facing, like what's an office for, that we have to ask now. So let's take a look at each of those guiding principles in a bit more detail. Number 1, building on the upside. As the organization starts to refreeze, as those crystals start to form and start to coalesce and start to move into something new, for people to really want to be part of that, they've got to feel there's something in it for them. I know from who's on the webinar today, we've got lots of people who are psychologists and sociologists, and we know, as you know, I'm a psychologist myself, that actually for people to change, there's got to be a good reason for it. And so it's absolutely crucial that even when people say, I don't want to go back to the old ways of working, the new way of working has got to have benefits for them. You've got to design those benefits into the architecture of the new forms, and you've got to make them very explicit. And that's what we have to do now. People are looking to you for direction and support. And I think most importantly, I know people right now are saying, we don't want to go back to where it was, but I can tell you that if what we develop in the next 6 months is unpleasant, then people will start to hanker after the past. And I don't think that's something that we want to happen. So now is the time to really think about how you build in and highlight the upsides. Let me give you an example of that. And the example I'm going to give, in order to write this Sloan column and indeed to do the webinar, I went out to a whole bunch of people and asked them, how are you thinking about COVID-19? How are you thinking about the way that you're working? And one of the people I spoke to, in fact, Christy Johnson, and I met her at a BBC panel. The BBC ran a panel on virtual working. And Christy's really interesting. She's based in California. And what's interesting about her is that she runs a company which is completely virtual. So this was completely virtual long before COVID hit. And so she's given us some really good ideas about how do you think about running a company where you don't have a lot of social connections. And actually it was she that said to me, you know, look, there are advantages of being at home and working virtually, but you've really absolutely got to hardwire those into the design of your business. You've got to accentuate the upside. So when we were talking about this, I said, well, what is the upside of working in a virtual company? And you know that yourself, that once you get the kids back to school, and goodness knows we all desperately need that, but once the kids are back to school, working from home for some of the time has got big advantages. The real advantages is that you have flexibility of time. And one of the things I've said before on those webinars is I'm worried that we're thinking a lot about flexibility in terms of location, but we're not thinking enough about flexibility of time. And one of the things that Christy's done is she's hardwired the benefits of flexible time in everything that they do at her company, Artemis Connection. For example, every job, every project they have is split up into the time required. People are then assigned a block of time to work, and if they can decide for themselves how much they take on. Now that's got implications for how people get paid, because they're not freelancers, they're all paid to be full-time members. But if they decide to do less one week and more another week, then that's part of how they're paid. So I think we've got to be much more thoughtful about, you know, working through what the benefits are of the next iteration of the organization, and how do we start hardwiring that in to practices like how we select people, how we pay them. I remember Christy has got quite a complicated remuneration practice because of that. How therefore do we split up jobs and make projects different, and how really do we go about telling people what the benefits are? And my feeling generally about COVID is that we've now made some broad statements about what we want the refreeze to look like. But honestly, as always, the devil is in the detail. And over the next month, we're all going to have to work out what the details are, because there will be implications for remuneration, for promotion, for selection, for project management, for how we work together in teams, and all of that has got to be worked out. So, you know, really making sure that as we work out those details, we get the positives right. That's going to be absolutely crucial. Let's take a look at the second big principle that I think is really important. And it's really a principle of adjustment. You know, the truth is that none of us know what the future will hold. You know, we don't know when there's going to be a vaccine. We don't know whether, we really don't know a great deal. And I know there's a whole bunch of us on this webinar from Melbourne. Hi, Melbourne. And they're in second lockdown, which is, I can tell you, pretty damn miserable for them. So, we know from countries around the world that the future is very unknowable during a pandemic. And so we have to make constant adjustments. And that means really listening to what people need and what people want. And it's about making constant adjustments. Let me give you an example of that. So this is a conversation I had with Anne Sheenan, who's the UK director of Vodafone, which is a very, very large business. Well, the first thing that Anne said to me was, it was astounding. We actually moved everybody into home working, those who could, within a week. And so they were really pleased about that. But then as she started listening to employees, and they had a whole set of ways of listening, what she found, and as you know, we found this through our own polls very early on this webinar series, the erosion of social capital. And that's actually continued in terms of networks. And there is a whole webinar on networks that you may want to look at. We found that people are spending more time with people who they know and less time with those serendipitous connections that are so important for innovation. And Anne also realized that people were feeling isolated. So this is one of the adjustments she made. So she had this rather nice experiment she ran called A Sandwich with Anne. And twice a week, she randomly selects 12 people from the organization. They could be from any walk of life. It's not just the senior people or the junior. It could be any part of her demography. She sends them all lunch, sadly not a 3-course meal with a bottle of wine, but a sandwich. But nevertheless, they all sit down with the same sandwich and they talk for an hour about life. And Anne talks to them about her experiences, how she's feeling. It's not a business conversation. And they talk about how they're feeling. Now, I said to Anne, is that going to be part of the long-term practice of your organization? No, she said, I'll probably just keep it until September. And that's really, important, because those of you who remember the Hawthorne effect know that actually, whenever you do something for your employees, engagement goes up. And then it starts falling down again. So after a while, people are going to get bored with Anne, lunch with Anne, and she certainly is going to get bored with doing it twice a week. But nevertheless, it's really important for now. And I think in terms of this emerging reality, we have to be clear that we have to make constant adjustments and realize that some of them are going to fail and be fine about that and just try again. So that's my second principle. Let me tell you a little bit now about my third principle, which is about being prepared now before the refreeze really starts to ask those hard questions. Now, what are those hard questions going to be? Well, one of the ones I think is important is, what is an office for? Or what will be our new values? Or how are we going to work virtually? Or how do we be sure that people with different caring responsibilities are not going to be discriminated against? And that means listening to employees. Now, the challenge with that is that normally you'd be listening to employees as they bump into each other in the lounge, as you have coffee with them. A lot of listening takes place. And that's going to be crucial because we have to absolutely co-create the answers. So how do you make sure that you listen to people, but you listen to them on scale? And that's where I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Harriet, to tell us more about how one of the companies we've been supporting through COVID, Arup, has thought about that. Over to you, Harriet.
Thank you so much, Lynda, and it's great to be here today. And good morning to everyone in Europe, good afternoon, good evening to all those of you over in APAC. I hope this doesn't feel too late for you. I'm Harriet Molyneaux, and I'm co-managing director, along with Emma Birchall, who you'll be hearing from shortly, of Lynda Grattan's HSM, the research advisory group that she founded just over 12 years ago. Now, we've had a really interesting time over the past few months. So pre-COVID, we were very much a specialist organisation. So clients might come and work with us if they had a particular future of work focus in their strategy, or maybe their new CEO wanted to really future-proof their business and be a little bit ahead of some of their competitors. Now, during COVID, we've suddenly found ourselves in the business continuity budget. So how do we make virtual work during these months? And right now, you're keeping us all very busy planning your new realities. So what does this blended reality look like? And for most of you, it will be a blended reality. How can we think through the opportunities? And crucially, how can we think through the potential unintended consequences? And Lynda's already mentioned a few of those this morning. Now, I'm really delighted to be talking about our client Harriet this morning. And you might not know Harriet, but you'll definitely have come across some of the things that they've created. So they're a global design, engineering and architecture company. There are 16,000 of them globally. And really crucially, they're member owned. And that's a really important part of their culture. So they're really iconic, and you can see some of the buildings that they've designed on your screens right now. Now, Harriet is going through a period of change. It's looking to future-proof its relationship with its clients, with its employees, and its position in the market. And their global people and culture leader, Jenny Emery, had the idea to do this in consultation with the entire organization of 16,000 people globally in one big crowdsourced conversation. So really tapping into those connections of loose ties across the organization that Lynda's already discussed. And now if we could just move on to the next slide. Thanks, Ellen. So can you imagine what it would look like if you got 16,000 people together from across your organization, 31 countries, to come and tell you what they think about your strategy in one big crowdsourced conversation? Well, let me tell you how we did this with Harriet. Now, Lynda shared earlier that you need to listen to your employees, and Harriet did just this, creating a campaign called True Vision Comes From Listening. Now, what did this involve? This involved human ears popping up across people's laptops and desktops over the course of a few weeks with the hashtag #AllEarsLive. Now, Harriet didn't tell people what they were doing. They just set this campaign across the organisation, and people knew that something was coming, but they weren't sure what it was yet. Now, in parallel, we were working with Harriet to identify the right questions to really make sure that this crowdsourced conversation was going to be set up for success. So the way that we did this was we engaged them in design thinking, so surfacing questions from the organisation, not superimposing questions onto the organisation. And we involved the right people in these discussions. So we certainly did talk with Harriet leaders, we did talk with people in organisation, but perhaps more importantly, we spoke with people on the front line. Now, these questions that we then created from a series of design workshops with a cross-section of representative stakeholders across many of those 31 countries that you can see on your screen now, were designed to introduce the new people strategy to the organisation, to sense check whether this people strategy was going in the right direction, what was missing, what was the organisation's blind spot, and then crucially to understand what people on the front line needed in order to translate this into reality. So really taking that slide deck from idea, conception, sitting on a slide deck, that strategy rather, and really turning it into day-to-day actions. And then we're moving on to perhaps the more exciting piece of this piece of work, that big crowdsourced conversation of 16,000 people across 31 countries. So let me tell you a bit about how we did this. Well, Harriet worked with us because we have a platform called the Collaboration Jam platform where we do precisely this. So we take organisations through 3 steps of perspective on day 1, debate on day 2, and action on day 3. And if you can imagine, it's a conversation that follows the sun 3 times over. So no matter where you sit in the world, you have 3 working days, if your organisation runs one of these, to contribute to the conversation and to build on the ideas of others. And so what do we mean by perspective? Well, we have a team of facilitators based globally from San Francisco across to Singapore. In fact, Hong Kong, I think, is the furthest country across, the furthest place across. And they guide the conversation through these 3 phases. And they're actually populating the platform with those questions from people on the front line from that design phase. So on day 1, perhaps someone might say, we need to collaborate more. And that's when we're asking people to just contribute ideas, build on the ideas of others, and crucially sense check, are they the right questions? So as we move into day two debate, the facilitators will come back and say, okay, why do we need to collaborate more? What does good look and feel like? What's the one blocker to you collaborating? Or perhaps what's the enabler? What does great collaborative leadership look like? What behaviours characterise this? Do we need to rethink a little bit how we're managing teams or technology to really enable ourselves to collaborate across the organisation? What might that look like? And then we move into the action phase, when the facilitators are able to say, okay, we've got a great understanding of what good collaboration looks like. We know what some of those blockers are, and we know the kind of leadership that really enables it. What can we do now to turn this into a reality? How do we need to consolidate our tech platforms? What's the 2 things that leaders can do to enable collaboration at scale? How can we really ensure that you're all able to collaborate on a day-to-day basis? So what did members at Harriet tell Jenny Emery and their leaders over the course of these 72 hours? Well, they said that the core pillars of Jenny's strategy were absolutely spot on. That transparency, purpose, innovation, and more collaboration, not less, interestingly, was going to be absolutely crucial to their organisation's success. And so what Jenny and Harriet have been doing is using these insights to support that group of 16,000 creative people working from home during COVID to enable them to still work in a creative, networked way. And as Lynda's already said, it's creativity in those weak tie networks that do appear to be particularly at risk during this time. And what's really nice, and I heard Jenny and Lynda talk about this on a webinar just a couple of weeks ago, is she says that they feel more connected than ever. And that like everyone is working together like one big hive across the organisation and those 16,000 people. So this is how Harriet decided to build and use this capability to co-create at scale with their employees. And then a question I'd like to leave you all with, perhaps the hard question that Lynda was talking about earlier, is what's that one challenge or question you'd like to put to your organisation if you ran one of these? And perhaps you can pop it in the chat box, or else just think about it over the next day or 2. And Lynda, I'll hand back to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Harriet. Harriet, let me ask you a question, and please do put your questions in, because we have time for a chat at the end of this webinar. Harriet, you know, when you take a look at these, these large-scale platforms that we're running, where we get sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, not even tens of thousands. How is it that you help people really move to an idea of what the actions are? Because that's always interests me, that not only you're having a conversation, but you also sometimes get sort of change. You identify groups of people who want to make the change happen together. Tell us a little bit about how you do that. I mean, how do you then sort of move that into questions about who could now be the stakeholder, who could be the champions of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a couple of points there, Lynda. So there's one during the actual conversation itself. That team of facilitators are absolutely vital. So as we'll all be aware, providing you get enough engagement on online platforms, you can have quite a lot of noise sometimes. And we feel that a real differentiator for us is having that team of facilitators. So constantly pushing for the action, constantly pushing for what might this look like in the future. So we get a little bit of challenges coming out, but mainly we're looking for solutions. So we understand not only what your employees are thinking, but why they're thinking it and how to overcome it. Now, after we've run the conversation, we analyse the data set and we look to understand who are your change agents across that conversation. So really looking at the different networks and conversations. And we look at that in terms of sheer energy and enthusiasm, so number of comments, cultural capital within the thread, so who's replying to those individuals specifically, a really important point, and then depth of insight. Were they making novel or really important perspectives? And then we then draw out who those change agents are, sitting across all three of those categories, what it is that they spoke about, and then our clients can work with them in sprint streams to embed those solutions and ideas across the organisation. And Lynda, what's so interesting about this is often clients will say, well, that person isn't particularly vocal in meetings, or, and this is common within organisations of the size of many of the people online today, I just had no idea those people existed within the organisation. And here they have a really great network of people in different parts of the globe, different levels of seniority, different parts of the business that they can work with to embed the insights and ideas coming out of the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much, Harriet, because I think, you know, we've been talking about co-creation for ages, and I think it's really one of, I'm about to launch a whole program on how you train your people on the future of work. And I do think one of the fundamental principles is co-creation. I think, you know, the days when we sort of sit at the top and say, this is how it's going to be right, those days are over. And I can see lots and lots of questions in the chat room, which we'll be able to get to, and maybe Harriet, you can take a look at those when we come back for our bigger questions. But before we do that, I want to take the other principle I talked about was about how do you keep on experimenting, how do you keep on adjusting. And actually, I'm going to hand over to Emma now, because Emma's been doing some incredible interesting work with one of the UK's big insurance, Brit, just about how do you really solve some of the problems and how do you do this process of co-creation and experimentation. So Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Lynda. So welcome everyone. I'm Emma Birchall, co-managing director with Harriet of the HSM. Where our focus is really on enabling companies to excel, driven by the power of their people. And with that in mind, I'm really pleased to share with you our work with Brit Insurance. And Brit Insurance, for those of you who aren't aware, are a leading global specialty insurer and reinsurer focused on underwriting complex risks, and part of the Lloyd's of London group with offices in the UK, USA and Bermuda. So if you've been to the City of London in the last few years, you'll probably seen that two of the most outstanding buildings are the one you can see on this slide here, which is Leadenhall, where Brit are based, and the Lloyd's of London building across the road from that, which is absolutely spectacular. We look forward to seeing those buildings one day soon. So in Lynda's presentation, she talked about experimentation and how it's more important now than ever that organisations like you are trying new things, and really importantly, getting your people to try new things and to be comfortable with experimentation. But how can you get your employees to experiment when for many of them, this simply hasn't been a core part of their job over the last few years? And we know that in our organisations, actually what we're really good at is creating stability, creating an environment in which people can make informed decisions, create certainty, build structure and governance. And what we're asking people to do right now is very different. Is to make decisions in uncertainty, to safeguard their well-being in a very different and difficult time when they don't have protocol. And so to answer that question, we've been working with Brit, and in particular Brit's CEO Matthew Wilson and Chief Engagement Officer Lorraine Denny, who I think is on this webinar today, so particular welcome to you, Lorraine, because this is exactly what they did. They decided that in order to get people in the organisation to take on future ways of working, they had to themselves experiment. They had to themselves demonstrate that they were willing to go into that uncertainty themselves and try something new. So what did they do? So Matthew and Lorraine tasked 70 people within Brit, that's around 10% of their employee population, with coming up with a bold and disruptive idea to future-proof ways of working, with a really important promise behind it. And that promise was that they were going to take forward at least one of those ideas. Now remember that at the beginning of this program, Matthew and Lorraine had absolutely no idea what that idea would be, except that they had already given people the mandate to be bold and be disruptive. So straight from the starting gate, they sent a really clear signal to that group in the organisation to say, we are going to trust you to come up with something really bold and challenging that's going to drive our company forward. And we ourselves are going to experiment with you and demonstrate that we're willing to take the risks and to be uncomfortable in the way that we are asking you to. So how did we do it? Well, first of all, we divided those 70 participants into 8 study groups. And those 70 participants weren't senior leaders necessarily. Actually, they were selected at random throughout the organisation, representing different levels, different geographies, everything from entry-level people all the way through to more senior managers. So already a really interesting group of people who probably hadn't worked together in this way before. So having divided them into 8 study groups, we then took them on a future of work journey to ensure they had the skills and inspiration to come up with those truly bold and disruptive ideas. And I think this is a really, really important part of what Brit did so well with this programme, was to ensure that when they asked people to do something different, such as try new ways of working, experiment, be bold, they said, and also we're going to support you. We're going to enable you to learn about what that looks like in practice, so you can take those steps forward comfortably and in secure in the knowledge that you have everything you need to do that. Because actually I think when we look at a lot of companies that are struggling with this, that's where the struggle happens. The disconnect between asking people to do something different, but not backing that up with a sense of support around how they're going to do that and enabling them to get those new capabilities. So that journey had 3 different phases. It started with the individual focus. We started with them. We asked them, how prepared are you as individuals for your own future of work? So don't worry about the organisation for now, let's just think about you. And we identified with them a set of risk areas by running a diagnostic to say, which of those future of work capabilities that we've identified are you currently developing, are you currently skilled at, and which do you think may actually be falling by the wayside? And then we provided bespoke learning to say, great, we've identified your risk areas, and now we're going to support you in learning to eradicate those risk areas, so you can again feel comfortable and secure that you as an individual are ready for your own future of work. We then looked at the organisational focus. So we asked them, how prepared do you feel Brit is for the future of work? And what areas do you think should be prioritised when thinking about those bold and disruptive ideas that Matthew and Lorraine would like from you? And again, we ran a survey with the group to get some data. So super important that people have data around where they should be prioritising. And then we inspired them in case studies of how other organisations are doing some of these new ways of working and pushing the boundaries. So they could say, oh, that's really interesting that company X is doing this. What can we take from that? How can we be inspired that and create our own signature within Brit? And then on to the phase that I love the most, which happened just 2 weeks ago, which was the hackathon. So each study group, facilitated by someone within the HSM team, created one idea that they wanted to take forward within Brit. And they pitched those ideas to Matthew, the CEO, Lorraine, the Chief Engagement Officer, and to Lynda Grattan, who, as you all know, is the CEO and founder of HSM and a professor at London Business School. And between the 3 of them, they selected the winning idea. Again, this was a huge moment, and I think it was quite an emotional moment for all of us in the project to see people who, across different levels of the organisation, so for some of them, they'd never done a presentation before because it just wasn't really part of their role. And now they were presenting not only to their CEO and Chief Engagement Officer, but also to London Business School professor. But they did it so well and so confidently because we equipped them with those skills as part of the future of work skills that they would need to succeed as individuals. So already they were putting into practice some of those capabilities they were learning. And that formidable panel then selected a winning idea. Now, I'm not going to tell you too much about the winning idea because that is Brit's IP, but what I will say is that it was a very bold new way of constantly channeling new perspectives into Brit. And it was an idea that hadn't previously been considered by leadership at that time. So it was completely new and fresh on the agenda and represented a real new way of working within the organisation by saying, actually, we're going to take an idea directly from you, from our employees, about how we're going to move Brit forward. And that gave everyone on that programme a real sense of ownership over that idea and ownership over the future they were creating together. The winning idea also incentivised people to continue broadening their experience, which is probably the part of it I love the most, as they progress their careers. So we know that the tendency for most of us is to narrow our focus over the course of our career. And sometimes that's required. But what we are missing out on often is that continual broadening of skills as we go through our careers. And we know from, well, just from the situation we're all in right now, but also at the trends around the future of work, that actually we need to continually broaden our skills, continually be curious about other skills that we don't currently have yet, because we don't know quite what we're going to need in the next stage of our career. So what were the outcomes for Brit? Well, I think one of the most important outcomes was role modelling from the very top. The fact that Matthew and Lorraine were so bold, so courageous in saying, we're going to take at least one of the ideas you come up with and we will implement it in the organisation. Shows that they themselves are willing to be curious, to experiment and to trust people with such an important task, even when they had no idea what that action would be. The second was around the upskilling of a critical mass of people in future-proofed capabilities. So Lorraine and Matthew made it safe for people in the organisation and safe for themselves by saying, we're not just going to ask you to come up with an idea off the top of your head. We know that's just not how great ideas come. We're going to upskill you and inspire you with what the future of work looks like in other organisations and what kind of skills and capabilities we really need as a company and as employees to drive this forward. So we're going to make sure you're informed and connected. And that critical mass of people, of course, starts to have a ripple effect throughout the organisation by demonstrating new behaviours, by talking about the programme they've been on, by sharing some of their learning points. And there's a whole series of learning modules that Brit now is able to share with everyone in the organisation to say, look, these are some of the areas that we are really excelling in and moving forward with. And then finally, a new initiative with a company-wide impact created by Brit employees themselves to future-proof their future. And this is really the underlying principle behind pretty much everything we do at HSM, is to say that the best ideas come from within your organisation. They can be facilitated by external thinking, and that's really important. But actually the capability you most need to be developing right now is how you leverage those great ideas, the inspiration and the knowledge of your thousands, hundreds, or even hundreds of thousands of employees in your company, so that they are part of driving the way forward with you and you're all walking in the same direction now more than ever. So what I'd like to leave you with, and some questions for you as you think about this over the course of the day, is how are you going to role model from the very top the behaviours that you're now asking of your people? How are you going to make that safe, not just for yourself, but for those individuals, by upskilling them in critical future of work skills? By that we mean things like making decisions in uncertainty, a really important skill, safeguarding well-being, curating diversity, all really important skills that we're asking people to use, but not necessarily educating them in, not necessarily supporting them in. So how are you going to upskill your people in those critical capabilities? And then how are you going to make sure that when you roll out company-wide initiatives, as all of you are going to be doing in the next few months, that when you roll them out, your people are right behind you, because not only do they believe in that, but they actually designed it with you. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Lynda.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much, Emma. And, Emma was saying that one of the sort of number of finales of the Brit learning journey is that everybody came in on a Zoom with Matthew, the CEO, myself, Emma, and the head of learning. And it was, really moving. And remember, as Emma said, what was astounding really about the process is, on one group, there would be somebody who's head of something or other for one of the businesses, and someone who works on reception. And I know we're all very keen to hear diverse voices, but we're generally very poor at doing that. And I thought that was, as Emma said, it was, I think we almost had tears in our eyes. It was such a moving moment. And I think I can see from the chat lots of interesting points there. But one of the things that's gone is ceremony. How do we create these wonderful ceremonies? And that was definitely, for me, one of the most moving ceremonies that I had seen since lockdown. 70 people on Zoom, we could see every single one of them, all coming together with that. Some of them had backdrops with their group name on it. It was just astounding. This is actually the first time, so we were very, very pleased to work with Brit, because this is the first time we've been wanting to run this future of work learning journey for some time, and this is the first time we've actually done it, and it was enormously successful. So we feel totally confident now that we're in a position to roll that out across other organizations. So do give us a shout if you're interested, because I have to say it was the combination of individual diagnostics, organizational diagnostics, trying to get the champions together. From your perspective, Emma, what do you, looking back, what were the three things, or two or three things that really made it successful for you? What would anyone who's thinking of those sorts of future learning journey, what would be your advice about how to make the thing really work?
I think what we loved about the programme was the incredible level of engagement. And that was driven by a few different things. First of all, we worked very closely with Brit to design something that would be engaging, and we put a lot of behavioural economics thought into that process. But also the fact that a lot of these people are at levels of the organisation where they wouldn't normally have access to this kind of programme. So getting some people in your organisation to work with across different levels, across different geographies in a programme like this makes them feel really special. And as Lynda was talking about, the Hawthorne effect, it makes them feel like, actually, we are part of this. We have got a really important voice here. And wow, my CEO is going to sit there and listen to me pitch an idea and potentially take it forward. This, I think, that only really struck me, as you said, Lynda, in the hackathon, in the moment when people were presenting, and we were all quite emotional about it because it's been such a wonderful journey, and we could really see that people were grateful for that opportunity to participate. I think the second part is closing the loop. So one of the challenges you see in so many organisations is the great intention to get ideas from people, and then leadership feel a bit overwhelmed and say, right, well, we don't know what to do with this, and then, you know, a quarterly budget comes through and everything else distracts us. But by having Lorraine and Matthew so committed to taking an idea forward and closing that loop has been a really important part of the programme. And I think people are really grateful for that, because it shows that the effort they're making and the courage they have shown in coming forward with an idea and really investing in this has been well rewarded. And I think the third thing is just the leadership of Matthew and Lorraine in this whole programme, the visibility they have had, and knowing how challenging both of their diaries are. I can tell you they've been absolutely fantastic in making it very clear, this is a priority for us. We're really in this, and we are really looking forward to hearing your ideas. So people throughout the journey at various different points had that visibility of their top leaders saying, we're listening, we're in this with you, and we can't wait to work with you on this.
Yeah, what I really loved about it is that when you designed the learning journey initially, it had, you know, some face-to-face elements, particularly at the very end, where everyone was going to pitch in front of the CEO with a glass of champagne in a fantastic room at the top of one of the iconic buildings in London. Of course, that wasn't possible, but actually it worked. Well, I don't mean, we didn't have champagne. You know that I'm very sad about that. I love a glass of champagne. But nevertheless, Annie, I can see you on the line, and I know you feel the same. But, you know, nevertheless, it actually worked brilliantly virtually. I think that's one of the things we're all learning, isn't it? That, and some people are making this point about weak ties. You know, how do you create those weak ties? And I was actually sort of moved and shocked really by just how much we were able to do that in that process, that so many people from across, every single person who was involved in that learning journey came on that day to talk about what they wanted the organization to become. It was really moving. Okay, I know I can see there's loads of questions coming on here. So I'm going to hand over now to Harriet, who's going to manage. I can see lots of you are asking questions. So Harriet's going to manage the questions. Harriet, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lynda, and I can see a huge number of questions. We'll try and get to some of them today, and I wonder whether the team could just put mine and Emma's email addresses into the chat box for anyone that we don't manage to get to your questions, because we'd love to discuss it with you. Lynda, the first question I'm actually going to send across to you this is from Balkis Atz, who said, when thinking about that freeze, unfreeze, refreeze motif that you shared at the beginning, how do you evaluate the risk that companies try to refreeze into the state before the pandemic? And I think this is something that you and I, Lynda and Emma, we've discussed at length actually, because there is a risk that organisations try to do this. So leaders trying to go back to what they feel secure in and maybe not feeling brave enough, because there is a lot of uncertainty, to fundamentally change. Yeah, it'd be great to get your views on that, Lynda.
Yeah, thanks. I saw that coming up, Harriet, and I thought it was a fantastic question. And you know, that metaphor of the frozen, unfreeze, refreeze is such an easy thing to say, isn't it? And we can all imagine it immediately. But then the question is, well, what does a refreeze look like? And like you, I would be very sad if we got back to where we were. You know, I think that we all have an incredible, oh, here's Rob, wonderful, yeah, an incredible opportunity to do things differently. But I think this is why I'm doing this webinar today, actually, and this is why I'm writing my Sloan article this week, is that part of running a diary is it's given me a really good temporal perspective on this journey that we're on. And I honestly can tell you, it's this week you need to start thinking about what it looks like. And I think that what I loved about both of the case examples we talked about today, both Arab and Brit, is that they didn't ask one person to do this for them. They actually reached out to a whole bunch of people. And I think, as Emma said, one of the things that did is it gave people courage, really, because it said, you know, if you listen to enough people, it's sort of obvious, you know, what it is they most need. And what I thought that Brit did that was really particularly interesting is, you know, people are knowledgeable, but you can do a lot more to make them more knowledgeable. And the fact that Em and her team, you know, taught people about the future of work, taught them what the concepts were, taught them about the impact of artificial intelligence and taught them about what other companies were doing, it meant that when people co-created an idea, they actually were knowledgeable. And this, I think, is really important. And I think if you want to create the new Refreeze, you want to hear from quite a lot of people, but you want them to be knowledgeable. You don't want you don't want just a mass of people saying this is what we need. So I think we're in a situation now where insight and knowledge is going to be really important, because I agree with a whole bunch of the comments that are coming up now, which is to say, you know, it will be such a shame to go back to where we are. And actually, you know, what we know is new ways of working are very difficult to sustain. Let me give you an example of that. If those of you who went to business school will perhaps remember that there's always a case that's taught about how one Danish company got rid of email and got rid of paper. Well, you know, a couple of researchers went back recently and found out, did they have paper and did they have email? I think you know the answer to that. Both of those had crept back in again. And so, you know, it's to be bold now is important, but we also have to realize that over time, organizations do naturally go back to bureaucratic processes. They do naturally go back to wanting leadership. And so we have to, you know, as we think about what we do on that, we have to be sure that what it goes back to is the most important things for our company. And that really takes me to this point about signatures, and a number of you have heard me talk about this before, but you know, it's great to hear what other companies are doing, and I, you know, as others have and HSM is very good at telling you what other companies are doing, but fundamentally you have to decide what's right for your company. You know, the context, the business strategy, you know, the style of your senior team, you know, what it is your consumers want, how the market is changing. And so you've got to build, you know, your iconic processes. And I think, you know, this is the time to start building your signatures. You know, the company will coalesce back to where it was, however much we hope it didn't. But I think you do have a chance now to put a couple of really important stakes in the ground. And those are going to be about, what will our signature be? What are the 2 or 3 things that we are going to do differently? And that as we rebuild our architecture, both our physical architecture, you know, in terms of our offices, but also our process architecture in terms of remuneration, you know, project management technologies and so on. What are those going to be? And I'm very keen to hear about what you think those are, because I think that's probably my next Sloan article. So if anyone's refreezing around iconic or signature processes, please do drop me a note and I can interview you, and we can interview you, and that will be something that I can write about, because I think, you know, I think that's a really important question. So Harriet, thanks for talking about that one.
Thank you, Lynda. And I think we've got time for 1, maybe 2 further questions. So do get in touch with Emma and I if we haven't answered your questions today. Emma, my next question is for you. And this is from Nino Totino, who asked, can you have role models at all levels? So informal leaders. This is something we definitely have a point of view on at HSM. And so I'll leave Emma to share a little bit more about this.
Well, a lovely question. Thank you, Harriet. The answer is, not only can you have role models at all levels, but it's so important to have role models at every level. And I think that's one of my favourite findings from our recent work, actually through some of our crowdsourced conversations with a law firm that was looking at well-being, was that they had assumed that when people felt they needed to stay late at work or had to be present in the office, some of these old bad habits that Lynda alluded to just now, they thought that people were probably doing that because they felt pressure from their leadership. You know, their leaders were role modeling presenteeist behavior, and they therefore felt they needed to do that. But actually, when they went out and asked people in a big crowdsourced conversation, well, what is it that really makes you feel that you have to have these behaviors that, you know, aren't healthy, don't support well-being? The answer they got was quite different. The answer was, well, no, it's not about our leaders, because frankly, they're always out anyway. We don't really see them in the office. They're partners in a law firm, they're selling work, meeting clients. It's peer-to-peer. It's the role models at the peer-to-peer level that really influence my behavior, because you know what? Those are the people I'm going up against for promotion. Those are the people I'm being compared to day to day from my leaders, but also myself. Those are the people I'm comparing myself to. So I think to Lynda's point about cementing and putting some stakes in the ground of those behaviours you want to keep, you've really got to make sure you have some role models at the peer-to-peer level within teams who are tasked with or given explicit permission to role model those behaviours, so that others, when they look left and right, which is mainly where people look for behavioural cues, are seeing those behaviours in practice.
Thanks for that, Emma. And as you can tell from what Emma shared there, that's a really fundamental way around how we do culture and behaviour change with clients at HSM. I'm afraid we've drawn to the end of our time for questions, because we're very keen to finish on time and give you opportunities to head back into your days or your evenings. I'm just going to hand over to Lynda to wrap up today's session.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, first of all, a big thank you to the whole team. You've seen two of them, Emma and Harriet, but you know we have a whole team behind us, so big thank you to them. Big thank you to all of you. We had a lot of people on the webinar today from lots of countries. We're here to help, you know that. I think I've said to a number of you, we've never been busier, and we've been incredibly busy in the last couple of months, and that means we've learned a great deal about you know what's a good way forward, and that's why I was so pleased to do that. We're going to continue our webinar series. Please do join us for the next webinar, which we've called Co-Creating the New Reality. That's on September the 9th. We'll send a note out on that. I'm going to continue to write for Sloan, so we'll send you that. And please, you know, we'll send you a recording of the webinar and of the survey insight reports. A number of you filled in the survey. We've now taken a look at that, the details of the next webinar. And of course, we're here to help. Emma and Harriet and our whole team is here to help you. So do please get in touch, or we'll get in touch with you and just talk about how we might help you through these very, very dark days. Because there's a number of you who've said, and this is my last point, a number of you have said, we now have a recession, and in the UK, we now have Brexit. So we've got a very difficult year ahead of us, and the more that we can do to help each other, the better. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the day. I know some of you, it's a time for a glass of wine in the evening. Some of you will be having your croissant. It's great to see everybody from around the world. Please do carry on being part of our community, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.